The Galactic Coalition had existed for 12,000 years before they discovered Earth. In all that time, across 700 member species, they had never encountered anything quite like humanity. The Coalition prided itself on order. Every species had a role. The managed trade routes, the built starships, the maintained peace through their massive. Everything worked perfectly because everyone knew their place and stayed in it. When the Coalition scout ship found Earth in the year 2157, they expected to find another primitive species. They would observe, categorize, and eventually integrate the humans into whatever role suited them best. The initial reports were not impressive. Humans lived short lives. Their bodies were fragile. They had no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. Their technology was barely capable of reaching their own moon. The Coalition observers wrote their assessment in 3 words: limited potential species. But the Coalition made a terrible mistake. They judged humans by what they were, not by what they could become. Ambassador of the was the first to notice something strange. She had been assigned to Earth as part of the integration team. Her job was simple: study the humans, find their strengths, assign them appropriate work within the Coalition structure. For the first 6 months, she watched humans go about their daily lives. She observed their cities, their farms, their schools. Everything seemed ordinary. Then she visited a place called a gymnasium. Inside, she watched humans deliberately making themselves stronger. They lifted heavy objects not because they needed to move them, but simply to make their muscles grow. They ran on machines that went nowhere. They stretched and pulled and pushed their bodies to absolute exhaustion, and then they came back the next day and did it again. Had never seen anything like it. In the Coalition, you were born with certain abilities. Those abilities defined your entire life. A could never become as strong as a could never develop the mental powers of a. You were what you were. That was the natural order. But humans rejected that natural order completely. She began investigating deeper. She found humans who had been born unable to walk, now running races. She found humans who had been born with weak hearts, now climbing mountains. She found humans who had failed at everything in their youth, now leading entire nations. The pattern was everywhere once she knew to look for it. Humans did not accept limitations. They saw weakness as a problem to be solved. Filed her report with growing excitement. She titled it simply, Capacity Building Species Identified. The Coalition leadership read it with confusion at first. The concept was so foreign to them that many thought she had made errors in translation. How could a species build its own capacity? Capacity was fixed. It was determined by genetics, by evolution, by the natural order of the universe. They sent a team of scientists to verify her findings. Doctor of the Synthetic Biology Division arrived on Earth with deep skepticism. He had spent 300 years studying life forms across the galaxy. He knew how species worked. He knew their limitations. He would prove that had simply misunderstood what she was seeing. 3 months later, sent an emergency transmission to Coalition headquarters. His message was brief and unprecedented. He wrote, "Everything we know about biological potential is wrong. Humans have shown us the error in our thinking. Request immediate reassessment of all species development protocols." The humans had shown something that shook him to his core. They called it neuroplasticity. The human brain could physically reshape itself based on learning and experience. A human who practiced music would develop new neural pathways specifically for music. A human who studied mathematics would grow the parts of their brain used for calculation. The brain was not fixed. It was constantly building itself based on what the human chose to do. And it was not just their brains. Human bones grew stronger when stressed. Human muscles grew larger when challenged. Human immune systems learned from every disease they fought. Every part of a human was designed not for a specific purpose, but for adaptation, for growth, for capacity building. Realize the terrifying implications immediately. The Coalition had spent 12,000 years accepting limitations. They had built their entire civilization around the idea that every species had a fixed role. But what if that was wrong? What if every species in the coalition had hidden potential that had never been developed? The Coalition Council called an emergency session and presented their findings together. They showed video of human athletes breaking records that had seemed impossible just decades before. They showed medical cases of humans recovering from injuries that should have been permanent. They showed the entire history of human civilization, which was really just one long story of people refusing to accept their limitations. The council was divided. Many leaders were frightened by what they heard. If every species could change, what happened to the natural order? What happened to the roles that had defined coalition society for? Some called for Earth to be quarantined. They wanted to keep this dangerous knowledge away from other species. But others saw opportunity. High Chancellor was the oldest member of the council. She had served for over 800 years. In all that time, she had watched the coalition slowly stagnate. Innovation had stopped centuries ago. The same families held the same positions generation after generation. Nothing ever changed because nobody believed change was possible. Made a decision that would transform the galaxy forever. She invited humans to assess the needs of every coalition species. She wanted them to find the hidden potential that had been ignored for thousands of years. The human assessment team spread across coalition space over the next decade. They went to every world. They studied every species. And everywhere they went, they found the same thing: untapped potential, ignored capabilities, limitations that existed only because everyone believed they were real. The human trainers worked with the merchant species for 3 years. They had always been weak and timid. They avoided conflict. They never fought. That was simply their nature. But the humans did not accept that explanation. They found that muscles responded to training just like human muscles did. They discovered that fear responses could be controlled through practice. Within 5 years, they had their own security forces for the first time in their history. They no longer needed to pay for protection. On the worlds, humans introduced a concept called cross-training. They were brilliant engineers, but their education system was extremely narrow. Each learned only one specific skill and practiced it for their entire life. Humans showed them a different way. They encouraged to learn multiple disciplines, to combine knowledge in new ways. The result was an explosion of innovation. New ship designs that were 50% more efficient. New materials that had never been imagined, that had always been smart. They simply had never been encouraged to use their intelligence in new directions. They were perhaps the most dramatic example. They were the warriors of the coalition. They were bred for combat. They knew nothing else. But the human assessors found something interesting in their history. Thousands of years ago, before the coalition, there had been artists and poets. They had painted and sung and created beautiful things. That part of their culture had been abandoned when they joined the coalition and were assigned their military role. The humans brought it back. They set up art programs on worlds. They taught music and dance and sculpture. At first, they resisted. Warriors did not create art. It was weakness. It was shameful. But slowly, some began to participate, and what happened next surprised everyone. The who practiced art became better warriors. The creativity they developed in painting translated to battlefield tactics. The emotional awareness they gained from music helped them understand their enemies. The patience they learned from sculpture made them deadlier marksmen. By building capacity in one area, they had accidentally strengthened another. This discovery changed everything. The coalition officially adopted what they called the Human Development Model. Every species would receive regular assessments. Every individual would be encouraged to grow beyond their supposed limitations. The old system of fixed roles was abolished. For the first time in 12,000 years, coalition citizens could choose their own paths. Not everyone welcomed the change. The old families who had held power for generations saw their authority threatened. The species who had benefited from the fixed system fought against reform. There were protests. There were riots. Some worlds threatened to leave the coalition entirely. But the momentum was unstoppable. Once species learned that growth was possible, they could not unlearn it. Once individuals tasted their own potential, they refused to go back to the old limitations. The changes spread faster than anyone had predicted. 20 years after first contact, the coalition was unrecognizable. The stagnation had been replaced by constant growth. Species that had been weak were now strong. Species that had been limited were now limitless. The entire galaxy was transforming. And at the center of it all were the humans, not as rulers, not as conquerors, but as teachers, as assessors, as the species that refused to accept that anything was impossible. Ambassador, now an old woman by standards, gave a speech at the 20th anniversary celebration. She stood before representatives of every coalition species and spoke about what she had learned from humanity. She said that humans were not special because of their intelligence. Many species were smarter. They were not special because of their strength. Many species were stronger. They were not special because of their technology. Many species were more advanced. Humans were special because they understood one simple truth that had escaped the rest of the galaxy. The truth that limitations exist only in the mind. The truth that every creature has the potential for growth. The truth that capacity is not something you are born with, but something you build. The galaxy had needed humans not for their abilities, but for their perspective. They had needed someone to look at them and see not what they were, but what they could become. They had needed assessors who would identify not their weaknesses, but their opportunities. As finished her speech, she looked out at the crowd. She saw security officers standing proud. She saw artists displaying their work. She saw poets reading their verses. She saw a galaxy that had finally learned to grow. And somewhere in that crowd, a small group of humans smiled. They were not surprised by any of it. They had always known this truth. They had grown up with it. They had built their entire civilization on it. Now, finally, the rest of the galaxy understood. Capacity was not a gift. It was a choice. And every creature in the universe had the power to make that choice for themselves. The age of limitations was over. The age of growth had begun.